Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to Thinking Out Loud at HOK. We're so very happy to see you here, some very familiar faces. It's great to see you, and thank you for coming along. We've got some students in the audience, and we're also very lucky to have here this morning the chairman of HOK, Bill Helmuth from the US. Thank you for being here, Bill. My name is Farah, and I'm the marketing principal for the London studio. And so to our speaker this morning. Stefan was born in Essex. His father was Polish and his mother was English. Stefan says he was a product of the Cold War. He fell into architecture at an early age. He witnessed Harlow Newtown being designed and built as a young boy. As a 10-year-old, he saw what were at the times exciting new buildings, and this seemed like a very different world to the village he was growing up in. Stefan studied architecture at Portsmouth University and subsequently worked at a private practice in Winchester for 16 years, designing schools in Hampshire. At the time, the County Council was recognized for its enlightened approach to the design of schools. Stefan moved into local government and was chief architect for Portsmouth City Council, and remained here for 8 years. Stefan was inspired by HOK, and the attraction was that he would be able to take his experience and apply this to a wider national setting within the UK. However, as always, just like mice and men, this did not go to plan. Since joining HOK, Stefan has worked across the globe, primarily in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, in East and West Africa and the US. He's worked everywhere apart from the UK. His passion remains creating inspirational learning environments for future generations. And so, without further ado, I really am very happy to introduce the reasonably charming Stefan Jakobek. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. I'm going to talk to you this morning about my last 15 years at HOK. As Farah said, I came here with a plan, and life turned out differently. And here's a quote from John Lennon, that, as I found out, it's not John Lennon at all. He borrowed it from somebody else. And that's going to be a recurring theme all through this talk this morning. 12 years ago, I was working on a university master plan project in Central Asia. And it was my first project outside of the UK. One evening, I fell into conversation with another Englishman in the hotel bar. And he was a recently arrived schoolmaster who'd been asked to establish a British public school in Almaty, which was the old capital of Kazakhstan. It was a chance encounter, but it took my career in a completely different direction. Since then, I found myself working across many continents, many people, many cultures, and they're all quite different from my own. On every project, it's the conversations about design that brought our cultures together. Now, at the time I visited, Kazakhstan was a very new state. It only recently emerged from decades of initially Tsarist and then Soviet rule. It was a young nation, but it possessed some very ancient cultures. Almaty was a 20th century Soviet city, slowly morphing into something quite different. And apparently a British public school is just what they needed to drive change. But looking around at the city, what I saw was traveling to meet my grandmother on the other side of the Soviet Empire in Warsaw in the 1960s. It was a homogenous culture. At the time, the country was experiencing a real economic boom, and new buildings were springing up everywhere. Some of the newer buildings, built by local architects who'd suddenly been given a dose of artistic freedom, were, in my opinion, quite bizarre. Imagine the Jetsons meeting the Klingons, is my only reaction at the time. But this was a product of the need to represent a new, forward-looking nation, but that had a cultural identity of its own, rooted in ancient past. It was kind of high-tech meets blue domes. But after that initial rush of financial adrenaline, something new was beginning to happen. Almaty, as it used to be known, had been a closed city. Soviet citizens could only enter with permission. It was a place closed to Westerners. When I arrived in 2006, there were still checkpoints on the edge of the city. They were no longer being used, but they were still there. It was a very culturally isolated place. That changed when Kazakhstan became an independent nation. People began to travel. People from other parts of the world arrived, and they began to talk to each other. And it's Alistair and me, our first conversation in Kazakhstan. My experience was about a small part of this story of significant economic growth and cultural interchange that this city was going to experience. The old Soviet system that existed before was quite different from our own. It's well known that their achievements in mathematics and science were far in advance of what was being achieved here. So what was it that Kazakh parents were looking for from a school in leafy Hertfordshire? And as a designer, I needed to understand that before I could begin to design. And Haileybury has its own unique cultural identity. It's founded in 1806 by the East India Company to educate a new generation of administrators for the Indian Empire. It includes such illustrious figures as Field Marshal Allenbury amongst its old boys. 17 of them have received the Victoria Cross. Its boarding houses are named after governors and viceroys of India. And if you were looking for a symbol of old imperial Britain, it's a really good place to start. But ironically, it's also the school of the socialist Prime Minister Clement Attlee. So it just goes to prove that rhetorical points are usually not very accurate. So why was this all really relevant? A design process always begins with the creation of a brief. Collect data, identify needs, and when you're working abroad, we need to understand local regulations. And it also involves a lot of conversation. And here's the scene of one of those extraordinary conversations we had on this project. There's an English schoolmaster on the left and a 90-year-old Russian architect who helped write the Russian building regulations. So we sat with this group to discuss classroom layouts, and they wanted to understand how we managed daylight and arranged desks. So, and the old regulations in the Soviet Union placed a lot of emphasis on direct sunlight into classrooms for, I think, 4 hours a day. And our basic design concept assumed east-west alignments of the teaching blocks, south-facing classrooms. Great, good start. I thought we were going to do well. But then the discussion turned to desk layouts. Windows to the south, teaching wall to the east. But the response I got that time wasn't quite so positive. It said, this is not acceptable. Light must always come from the left. And perhaps it was my naivety and a little bit of jet lag, but I assumed that this was something to do with truth coming from the left in the old Soviet Union. But I was gently told that no, when children are writing, the hand is going to cast a shadow on their writing. I thought about it and said, how do we accommodate left-handed students? And I got a really swift reply. Okay. Now, that's a very small and perhaps trivial example of cultural differences, and my first reaction is often bewilderment. But after encounters like this, I think I've learned to question my own preconceptions, and I hope I've learned to approach each dilemma with an open mind. So we did discover some much more profound cultural differences. And when we spoke with ministry officials, they wanted to understand Haileybury's pedagogical approach. They wanted to understand their curriculum. They were nervous of the new. They were nervous of change. But we had a conversation with Haileybury's Director of Studies, and she relayed her experience of tutoring a young Kazakh through his A-level history course. Now, he was a product of the old Soviet system. The history curriculum was delivered a series of government-approved facts, which students were expected to remember, but not to challenge. And she described to us her delight in opening this young man's eyes to a new world. It's a place where he could learn to think for himself and to challenge received knowledge. And at that point, I began to understand the vision of this project. a search for an appropriate architectural language wasn't quite so easy. And here we are. I've shown you leafy Hertfordshire. This is snowy Kazakhstan in January on our first site visit, looking for inspiration. The architectural references that Hayley provides come from a very different era and a different place. This is the architecture of William Wilkins, Reginald Blomfield, and Herbert Baker. And while still providing very valuable cultural references at home, how appropriate are these in a new setting on the other side of the globe with different cultures, different climates, and different technologies? Our design approach could never be one of prestige. And even if we got the time and the budget and the skills on site to reproduce ionic columns, Portland stone, quads, and the copper dome in Hertfordshire, and believe me, this idea was suggested to us several times, but these typologies are highly inappropriate for working the extreme climate of Central Asia. But what was really required was a design approach that responds to the need for the 21st century liberal education on the other side of the planet. Now, the other challenge, the cultural enthusiasm that existed in Kazakhstan and its confidence also required that this building was going to be designed and delivered within 18 months, and a supply chain that extended 4,500 kilometres to the west, and it was all delivered on lorries. It wasn't about importing visual culture, it's about importing ideas. So this is how our design responded. This is a building that's intended to represent transparency, freedom of movement, freedom of ideas. Visitors arrive into this central learning resource. It's a gathering point at the centre of the school. It's spacious and airy. Classrooms and laboratories gather around and overlook the space. It's intended as a place that celebrates the individuals and the achievement of the school. And this is the approach we adopted for younger pupils, that lightweight ETFE roofs provide really valuable indoor space when the temperature drops well below zero in the winter. And at all times of the year, the space is flooded with daylight. This school is intended as a vibrant, confident place, and also a building that's thoroughly at home in its locality. And I hope that we've played our part in transferring ideas that have value in this new setting. So what do we bring back home? This is always a two-way process. When we were appointed at the beginning of 2007, the site had not been identified, but the expectation was that the school was going to open in August the following year. And truthfully, I was very sceptical. As I looked around at a shabby old Soviet city and the commercial anarchy that all the recent oil money was bringing, my attitudes told me this would never happen. I was really wrong. As planned, the school opened for business on the 1st of August 2008. And this was not a discreet opening. It was the very first day of term, and the school opened with confidence and style. On that very first morning, the new headmaster was presented to the mayor of the city. Several hundred children, their parents, their grandparents, aunties and uncles, all arrived at the front door. Kazakhs and Englishmen looked at each other across the room, and at the same time, the contractors' lorries were sneaking out the back. And those that know me, and I've just demonstrated, know I can be quite emotional, and after a short while, I had to withdraw into a corner of the room. But at that moment, I bumped into a very burly Turkish contract director who's doing exactly the same thing. Moments like this are really special. For me, what makes our planet such an exciting place is human interaction and cultural exchange. We can be so much better at what we do if we can embrace this with an open and curious mind. I've used the word culture a lot this morning. It's one of those concepts very difficult to pin down to define, but it's also very easy to throw around. Most of us will agree that an architect such as Christopher Wren is a major figure in our culture, but if we're defining who we are, surely we should acknowledge those anonymous figures that created the everyday environment that surrounds us. And if Elgar represents our musical culture, so do the Spice Girls, Ed Sheeran, and the band that plays in my pub on Wednesday night. Culture's not easy to define. This is one of the best definitions I've ever encountered. It's never static, that's heritage. For me, culture is a dynamic, ever-evolving process. And to illustrate this, here's some of my culture over the last 60 years. These are some of the influences around when I was a schoolboy in the 1960s. And as Farah mentioned at the beginning, Freddie Gibbard may be long forgotten, but when I grew up close to Harlow Newtown, as a 12-year-old boy, I looked across at shiny new comprehensive schools being built out of glass and aluminium, and they made a big impression. My school was made out of brick and tile, and they were still beating us with enthusiasm, okay? And here we are 10 years later now. I'm a hungry, very young and easily influenced architectural student in the 70s. And quite a few of these icons are still around today. Well, they are in my house. And who do we see in Britain today? Really sadly, David Bowie has only just left us, but there's a wealth of new faces and new ideas. Even Europeans are being allowed to build major new buildings in the UK. And the Brits that we see around us today in 2019 are very different from the Brits of 60 years ago. This is not intended as an accurate representation of our culture, it's just a snapshot. But I hope it illustrates how culture continually evolves. Although our society has never been isolated, we've become much more open to new ideas and wider cultural influences. After we'd finished this project in Almaty, we very quickly found ourselves doing something quite similar for another British public school, this time for Marlborough College in Johor Bahru. And others followed. We did 2 projects in Nigeria and another project in Mauritius. And they all followed a similar pattern, a British client exporting their ideas into a new setting. And a plan was beginning to emerge. But as I said at the beginning, is all good plans, life gets in the way. One morning, I received a very unexpected call from a man in Nairobi. He was a representative of His Highness the Aga Khan and asked if we were interested in bidding to design a series of residential schools in East Africa. This was part of a chain to be built across the world, in Africa, South and Central Asia, and the Middle East. And after a short pause, I said, yes, please. And I've talked about the transformative vision of the school in Almaty. The vision of this project took us to a whole different new level. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Aga Khan, he's the 49th Imam and the spiritual leader of the Shia Ismaili Muslims. This is an ethnically and linguistically diverse community of 15 million people across 5 continents. And among the many goals His Highness works towards are the elimination of global poverty, promotion and implementation of religious pluralism, the advancement of the status of women, and the honouring of Islamic art and architecture. And as I alluded earlier, the notion of culture as a component of identity in an increasingly globalised world is seen by many people as a threat to cultural identity. Some early words we received about his vision have stayed with me ever since. I'm going to read this because this was a seminal moment. He said, the quest for identity can become an exclusionary process so that we define ourselves less by what we are for and more by whom we are against. I believe that the coexistence of these 2 impulses, one might call a new globalism on one hand and a new tribalism on the other, will be a central challenge for educational leaders in the years ahead. And this is particularly true in the developing world with its kaleidoscope of different identities. And I say it again, those words have stayed with me ever since. And somehow they seem more appropriate today, even than 10 years ago when he spoke these. And if this wasn't sufficient challenge, His Highness has also established the Aga Khan Award for architecture. It's one of the most respected architectural awards in the world, and grew out of his desire to revitalise creativity in Islamic societies. And here's a recent winner. It's the Baitul Ralph Mosque in Bangladesh. It's a very simple building. It's very, very beautiful. At moments like this, I think the only reasonable reaction is a sharp intake of breath. This was the challenge. We were to design 2 schools and the associated residential accommodation for 1,200 pupils aged from 4 to 18, their teachers and their teachers' families. The vision was to create a contemporary architecture rooted in its location and its cultures. And I was about to leave my comfort zone. The 2 schools, one in Dar es Salaam and the other in Maputo, are sited on the Swahili coast. This stretches from the mouth of the Persian Gulf down to the coast of Mozambique. It's a trade route that has existed for over 1,000 years and has connected communities from India and Arabia with those of East Africa. The Swahili language contains Bantu, Arabic, Persian, Hindi, European elements. Cultural interchange is not a modern phenomenon. While we were still bidding for this project, we were taken to see the school site in Dar and Stone Town in Zanzibar. This is a site of major historic and artistic importance in East Africa. And for those of you that can, I encourage you to visit. Its architecture is mostly from the 19th century, and it's composed of a very diverse pattern of cultural influences. Building forms are primarily Arabic, principally from Oman, but the architecture is adapted with time and with place. So lightweight iron roofs are later additions, they're shelter terraces, and they capture coastal breezes. And it doesn't take long to capture evidence of Indian, Persian, and European inhabitants of Stone Town. This is a very culturally diverse place, and its architecture, like its language, provides the evidence. I have found that when you're looking for an architectural language appropriate to culture and place, you just have to look around you. Vernacular architecture always provides simple, economic, and effective answers to the management of climatic challenge, economy in the use of materials, and the employment of appropriate decorative languages. But to use those influences properly, a design needs to be creative and understanding of how and why these solutions were created in the first place, and how they can be employed in a changed and modern world. So here are some of our first thoughts for the Academy project, Dar es Salaam. The buildings we saw showed us how to exploit the pattern of seasonal trade winds to support natural ventilation strategies. The thermal mass of thick external walls balances internal temperatures. Overhanging screens shade the building and external spaces, and where appropriate, can balance the needs of privacy between the public and the private worlds. I also believe that it's our wider international experience that's helped us to create design that transcends cultures. These campuses are intended to show students they're citizens of a much wider global community. And we were lucky to work with engineers and landscape architects that shared that vision. My experience of working with the Aga Khan and his community has a profound influence on my attitude towards design. It's provided me with insight into a world that I hadn't encountered before, and I've been privileged to work with a quite rightly very demanding client. He challenged me and my colleagues to think harder and differently about the cultures and the attitudes that can both separate and unite us. And it was design that provided the framework to explore this dilemma. I'm going to say goodbye to East Africa. This is the first phase of the school in Maputo. I'm going to take you across the Indian Ocean to Kuala Lumpur. My colleague Quinton and I have just returned from Kuala Lumpur to attend the opening of a very large international school in the centre of the city. It's taken up 8 years of my life, numerous challenges and the occasional triumph, and the opening was very special. And if you were there, where's Quinton? You've been able to observe 2 men weeping. The International School of Kuala Lumpur is a not-for-profit school run by the parents. It's American in its origin, but its community is made up of 47 different nationalities. It's inclusive and internationalist in its outlook and part of a group of similar schools spread across Southeast Asia, each with its own identity. But we were asked to design a school that's of its place. This was the International School of Kuala Lumpur, not of Manila, Bangkok or Jakarta. The design was expected to be forward-looking, able to adapt to new pedagogies and evolving technologies. Above all, ISKL asked for us a highly sustainable building and a campus. This was a school for the children who will inherit the environment we are creating today. Malaysia is a society with very distinct Malay, Chinese and Indian communities. There's a political notion of one Malaysia and it's a gentle and peaceful place, but these communities still remain culturally quite separate. National identity is a very sensitive issue. Cesar Pali's Petronas Towers are now over 20 years old and still stand an example of exceptional contemporary design, a unique expression of modern Malaysia rooted in its context, and it remains so despite competition from Lord Foster and Jean Nouvel on adjoining sites. Our task was a bit more modest, but the challenge was equally demanding. The sustainability target was the biggest challenge, and the climate is very different from our own. There's no seasonal change in temperature and little difference in temperature between day and night. It's very hot and very humid all of the time. The only significant seasonal change is in rainfall, with an average of 5 inches of rain in June, which is the dry season, and 11 inches of rain in April. And by comparison, England is about 2 inches a month. And air quality is further challenged by smogs caused by forest fires in Sumatra as they clear the rainforest. European experience gets you so far, and then you have to start thinking afresh. We began from the assumption that this would have to be a relatively sophisticated building, but most importantly, it needed to be a very efficient, low-energy building. Sophistication shouldn't always imply high-tech. Extended supply chains create real maintenance problems in the developing world. Our design approach adopted a high-concept, low-tech approach. Let the building do the work and keep the tech to a minimum. And again, this is where understanding of simple, local vernacular approaches to design begin to have meaning. These design solutions evolved before sophisticated technology. They represent local solutions to local problems, and they've become part of local culture. Traditional Malaysian buildings are lightweight and open to breezes. Indoor living is raised to the first floor. The ground floor is open, but provides shelter from wind, and most importantly, from rain. Our design adopts a similar approach, with much of the ground floor and circulation routes open to air movement, and large breezeways capture prevailing winds. Social and dining spaces are all open air and connect across buildings, providing visual connectivity across the campus. In a similar fashion, the design looks to traditional batik fabric patterns and reinterprets them into the brickwork, a concept that was relatively simple to execute with very limited local materials. It's had a striking impact on the elevations. It belongs entirely to its Malaysian settings. For me, this is an example of contemporary architectural expression rooted in its locality and the cultures that surround it. And when I walked around the building that day, I was struck by how effective the design had been in tempering the climate. Open circulation routes really do capture the breeze and reduce perceived temperatures. Pupils are sheltered from the intense sun, at the same time connected to the outside and across to the city. Long routes through the school, and that spine block is nearly 0.5 kilometre long, are punctuated by regular pools of sunlight and natural planting. This is modern in its execution, but employs principles that have been used in the region for centuries. I'm concluding my talk at this point, but I hope I've shared a hypothesis that design transcends culture, and I hope my story will help you share this premise. My lasting thought is the relevance of so many cultural influences all around us in this great city in London we call home. That's why it's such a special place and why I enjoy working here. So thank you all.
I thought it was really refreshing. I like the humility that comes across with is having ideas from the UK, but taking them abroad and then seeing how things are done abroad. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes people go in and this is how we're going to do it. And I found it really refreshing that they're looking at local culture, local styles of building, local materials. There's a lot of innovation. Everybody's hooked into innovation. But what really came across in the talk was the use of appropriate innovation. And particularly when they were talking about building really quickly, you've got to use local skills. Aviation is really interesting because essentially the way in which passengers have to be dealt with at all the airports is very similar. But to bring a sense of local feel to the airport is really important. It's becoming more important because everybody's saying that you're traveling around the world and you get off an aircraft and you could be anywhere because the airports are very similar. And so I think there is a big drive to try and get some of exactly what was being talked about today, some local culture, some local thinking into the airport design.
I really like the high sophistication on the design, low tech, and I thought that had a really strong link to how do we solve mega challenges of sustainability in the future. So there was one slide on sustainability aims, and I was really interested to see how architectural design might influence the performance of buildings into the future. So I thought that was really strong. Well, I think he was presenting something which was not dogmatic and an understanding of local typologies, local culture, local influences, and using that and embedding that in the design of the building. So I thought that was really strong, actually, and it would seem as when you actually present a less forceful impression, that's seen as perhaps weak architecture, but actually I think that's the strongest architecture, those who are better at collaborating, who are stronger at accepting ideas, whether those are technical, social, cultural, are much better architects overall. So actually, rather than a weakness of not having a dogmatic design, it's a much stronger ability. So I thought that process that you were suggesting was really, really important. The idea of collaboration rather than competition was really, really important. And I think he was also signalling this idea about, tribes versus globalism as an idea of how do we work together to meet global challenges as well. So all of those aspects, I think, are particularly strong as we come to facing and dealing with some of the influences in architecture and engineering overall. I would really like he went back to look at the performance of the buildings as well. So this lack of technocratic solution, how do those actually then meet in-service requirements of the users? So actually looking at the performance of those long term, and how can you break out of a technocratic solution, I think would be a really interesting thing and very good if you actually published that.